What if the rifle you trust cannot stop what is coming straight at you? From Alaska's foggy ridges to Europe's dark forests, every step turns into a split-second fight to live. You'll see claws on granite, tusks in mud, and hunts flipped in a heartbeat when the wild hits back. Stay with me till the end to find out why power, speed, and terrain can make even a mighty rifle feel useless. Late August 2025 in the Coldspire Mountains of Alaska brought danger hidden in the fog, where Garrett Thorne tracked a bull moose along a narrow granite ridge. The cold mist clung to his clothes, soaking his pack and boots as he moved carefully across slick stone, every step one slip away from disaster. In his hands he carried a .338 Winchester Magnum fitted with a heavy 20-time scope, a weapon built for distance, not for the sudden close terror about to unfold. The silence of the ridge broke in a heartbeat when a 1,700-pound Grizzly burst from the alders, its massive frame surging forward with raw speed. The ground trembled beneath its charge, claws striking stone, its roar shattering the calm. Garrett lifted his rifle, the scope slowing his aim as the beast closed the gap in seconds. He fired point blank, the round slamming deep into the bear's shoulder. Blood sprayed across the fog, but the sheer density of muscle and hide absorbed the shot. The animal roared louder, driven by adrenaline, its weight unfazed by what should have dropped lesser game instantly. Garrett cycled the bolt with shaking hands, sweat and fog blurring his vision, and fired again. This time the round tore into its chest, but still the giant kept coming, each stride pounding closer, eyes burning with fury. The cliff left no space to retreat. Jagged stone pressed against his back as the bear slammed into him, its bulk driving him against the granite wall. His pack shredded instantly under the force of claws that ripped through straps and fabric, tearing gear apart like paper. The weight of the impact rattled his bones, the cliff edge crumbling inches from his boots, one slip away from a fatal fall. His scope, built for long range, slowed him again, costing precious seconds as he tried to bring the rifle to bear in such close quarters. The roar filled his ears, claws scraping sparks from stone as the Grizzly lunged again, furious and unrelenting. Desperation carried his final shot. He pulled the trigger a third time, the bullet grazing across the animal's shoulder as he flinched under its looming bulk. The wound staggered it for a brief moment, its body twisting with pain. Breath steaming in clouds, the beast hesitated, snarling in defiance before turning toward the fog. Its heavy form faded into the mist, each step still shaking the ground until silence reclaimed the ridge. Garrett collapsed against the rock, his chest heaving, hands trembling on the rifle that now felt small and useless. His pack lay shredded, gear scattered down the slope, and the granite face behind him bore claw marks, etched like scars into the stone. The air was heavy with blood, gunpowder, and the sharp sting of fear. The truth sank in hard. On that narrow ridge, even the strongest rifle was almost powerless against a predator built to rule the wild. Garrett leaned against the cold granite, his breath ragged as the silence settled over the ridge. His body shook from exhaustion, and the weight of fear pressed heavier than the rifle in his hands. The fog wrapped the trail in pale sheets, swallowing the last echo of the beast's retreat. Around him, the cliff bore scars that told the story without words. Long claw marks scored the rock, strips of fabric hung from jagged edges, and bloodstains darkened the stone where the struggle had taken place. His shredded pack lay in fragments, scattered across the slope, its contents lost to the depths below. Each attempt to move sent sharp pain through his shoulders and ribs. The strike against the cliff had left bruises spreading beneath his skin, and the weight of the collision rattled his bones. He forced himself upright, dragging aching legs along the narrow ledge, each step a battle against the wind that howled across the ridge. The rifle felt heavier with every stride, more symbol than shield, its power stripped by the memory of rounds that had barely slowed the charge. He knew now that steel alone was not enough when raw muscle and instinct bore down without pause. Hours stretched as he stumbled downward toward lower ground, guided only by faint outlines of stone visible through the mist. His boots slipped often, sliding on slick granite, scraping skin raw where he braced against the cliff. The weight of exhaustion pulled at his body, but the thought of still being hunted kept him moving. Every crack of rock in the distance made him tighten his grip, eyes scanning shadows as if expecting the hulking shape to burst again from the fog. The ridge no longer felt like a hunting ground. It had become a place where survival was measured only by the will to keep moving. When at last he reached the base, the sight of scattered spruce and the faint outline of his camp brought a wave of relief. He collapsed near the fire pit, his body trembling uncontrollably, blood stiffening the cloth across his back. The flames, faint and weak, barely touched the chill that had settled into his bones. His gear was torn, his supplies ruined, but the fire's glow reminded him that he had outlasted the ridge, if only just. The night stretched long, each gust of wind through the branches carrying with it the memory of claws striking stone and breath steaming against his face. By dawn, the ordeal had become more than wounds and broken gear. The Wrangell Mountains had stripped away certainty, showing that even the strongest weapon could falter against raw strength. Garrett knew that the scars of that night would last far longer than the bruises on his body. For him, survival had not been triumph, but revelation, a reminder written in blood and stone that in the heart of Alaska, power belonged to the wild first and always. November 2025 in the oak forests of Poland's Krasova Forest brought a scene of danger hidden beneath calm autumn air. Marek Nowak moved slowly through the thickets, his 7x57 Mauser steady in hand, eyes scanning the ground where tracks marked the presence of wild boars. The trees stood bare, their branches skeletal against a gray sky, while the ground was soft from days of rain. Fallen leaves covered the forest floor, masking deep bogs that turned each step into a gamble. The stillness carried weight, broken only by the faint rustle of hidden animals, a silence that disguised the chaos about to erupt. Circling through the brush, Marek sought a clear view of the herd he had been tracking. His boots pressed into soggy earth, each step sinking slightly, yet he pushed forward, focused on the hunt. Then the soil betrayed him. His foot plunged suddenly into thick mire, the cold mud pulling him down to his thighs before he could react. He struggled to free himself, lifting his legs with all his strength, but the suction of the bog refused to release him. The weight of his rifle grew heavier in his trapped hands while panic began to press against his chest. From the thicket ahead, the forest erupted. A massive tusked boar, its bristles sharp and body well over 300 pounds, burst into the clearing with terrifying speed. Foam flecked its jaws, rage flashing in its dark eyes as it fixed on the figure caught helpless in the mud. The ground shook with each stride as it charged, splashing through the muck, tusks gleaming like blades in the dull light. Marek's heart pounded as he tried to raise his Mauser, but the angle was wrong, the barrel barely clearing the surface of the mire. With the beast closing, he pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted his trapped body, nearly wrenching the weapon from his hands. The shot struck, but shallow, slicing into muscle without stopping the animal's momentum. It roared with fury, lowering its head, the curved tusks flashing closer with every stride. The bog held Marek fast, his legs locked in place, the weight of the earth turning his rifle into little more than a fragile hope. The boar surged forward, mud spraying in thick arcs as it bore down on him. His arms shook as he tried to chamber another round, but time collapsed. The distance shrank to seconds, the thundering rush of hooves drowning all sound. Then, from the side, his hunting dog lunged. The animal snapped hard at the boar's flank, teeth finding purchase just enough to startle. The beast veered sharply, slashing sideways, missing Marek by inches before it spun into the undergrowth. The mire fell silent once more, but Marek remained trapped, soaked, shaking and breathless. His rifle trembled in his hands, the mud clinging like chains around his legs. The realization cut deeper than the wound in the boar's shoulder. On that day in that forest, even an armed man was powerless when the very ground beneath him held him hostage. Marek stayed frozen in the bog long after the wild boar had vanished into the dense oak scrub, his chest rising in sharp bursts while his dog circled back, splattered with mud but unhurt. His rifle weighed heavily in his hands, slick with dirt, and his legs throbbed where the sucking mire had held him. It took long minutes of straining before he pulled free, collapsing onto firmer ground, his body coated in muck from waist to boots. The bog had not only trapped him, but stripped him of control, leaving him weak and shaken as silence crept back over the forest. The ground around him bore the scars of the attack. Deep hoof marks gouged the mud, splashes of water and sludge flung high onto nearby trunks. The smell of disturbed earth mixed with the sharp tang of gunpowder still hung in the damp air. His own footprints told the story of his struggle, sunken holes filled with dark water where the bog had nearly swallowed him whole. The Mauser stock was scratched and streaked with grime, its barrel still smoking faintly from the desperate shot that had done little to slow the beast. Gathering himself, Marek stumbled to a fallen tree and sat, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. The dog stayed close, its ears twitching at every faint rustle from the underbrush. He checked his gear, finding his pack soaked, cartridges coated in mud, and his knife clotted with muck. Every item spoke of vulnerability, a reminder that no equipment mattered when the land itself turned against him. The forest that had once seemed like a place of skill and pursuit now felt hostile, its beauty laced with menace hidden beneath fallen leaves. Hours passed before he regained strength enough to move slowly toward the trail that would take him back to his camp. Each step was heavy, his boots squelching with water, his body chilled from the damp. The memory of the tusks flashing inches from his chest replayed with each sound in the distance. Every crack of a twig or flutter of wings sent his hand toward the rifle, though his arms shook too much to lift it easily. By the time he reached the edge of his camp, dusk had fallen, and the trees loomed dark, their shadows stretching like walls around him. That night, he sat by a small fire, clothes steaming as heat dried the mud from his skin. His hands traced the shallow dent on the rifle stock where panic had nearly cost him his grip. The realization grew heavy. No weapon alone could protect him when the ground itself bound him in place. The boar had shown him that survival was not always about firepower, but about the ability to move freely. In the mire, he had been prey, saved only by the loyalty of his dog. The lesson carved itself deeper than any scar. Out in the wilderness, even the earth could betray. Early November 2023, in the Ozark hardwoods carried the sharp bite of autumn air carried. The forest floor was thick with damp leaves that muffled footsteps. Caleb Mercer moved carefully along a ridge, rifle balanced in his grip, following the heavy prints of a rutting whitetail buck. The animal, a 12-pointer in peak season, had left fresh signs of aggression along the trail, saplings shredded by antlers, bark scattered across the ground. Caleb's eyes traced the broken brush until movement revealed the giant figure. Antlers darkened with bark and sap, its body tense with raw energy. At 140 yards, he steadied his Winchester, scope narrowing on the broad chest. His breath slowed as the trigger broke, the rifle cracking through the trees. The shot landed, but too far back. Instead of falling, the animal staggered, twisting violently, its breath steaming as it reeled. Pain fused with fury, and the buck turned, no longer prey but attacker. Its eyes locked on the hunter, muscles driving it forward through the undergrowth. Caleb tried to cycle the bolt, but the mechanism caught with a click, mud clogging its motion. His hands fumbled in panic as the sound of pounding hooves grew louder. The buck surged from the cover, antlers lowered like sharpened branches aimed at his chest. Instinct pushed him back, the rifle now a club rather than a weapon. He swung, deflecting one antler tine with a jolt that rattled his arms, but the force of the charge flung him off his feet. He landed hard in a bramble patch, thorns tearing into his skin as the buck towered above, its hooves striking the ground in rage. Leaves exploded around him as the animal thrashed, antlers carving through brush just inches from his body. He rolled desperately, branches snapping under his weight as the buck tore at the patch, its breathing heavy, every move filled with blind aggression. Then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the animal veered away. Blood loss and chaos pushed it into the timber, crashing through trees and leaving silence in its wake. Caleb lay on the ground, his clothes ripped, arms streaked with cuts, and his chest heaving from shock. The rifle lay twisted in the brambles beside him, its barrel coated in mud, useless against what had nearly taken his life. The woods around him seemed still again, but every broken branch and gouged patch of earth told the story of how quickly the hunt had reversed. One misplaced shot had turned the moment into a desperate struggle. The deer was gone, but the reminder was carved deep. Sometimes the line between hunter and hunted vanished in the space of a single breath. Caleb lay among the torn brambles, his breath ragged, body aching from the impact. Slowly he pushed himself upright, thorns clinging to his clothes and blood running in thin lines down his arms. His chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing, every muscle trembling from the sudden burst of violence. The forest was silent now except for the fading sound of branches cracking in the distance where the buck had fled. The silence carried weight, heavy with the knowledge of how close he had come to being crushed under antlers and hooves. The ground around him told the full story. Leaves were shredded where the animal had charged, soil torn open in deep gouges, and saplings bent low from the force of its thrash. The bramble patch was flattened where he had landed, its sharp stems snapping under his body. His rifle lay twisted nearby, the barrel clogged with dirt, useless for anything more than a broken club. Every mark in the earth was a reminder of how quickly the line between hunter and hunted had shifted. He gathered himself enough to stand, but pain flared in his ribs and legs, forcing him to lean against a tree. Cuts burned across his skin, and his hands stung where thorns had ripped deep. He reached for his pack only to find it torn open, contents spilled across the ground. Cartridges, food, and gear lay scattered among the leaves, some ruined by mud. The hunt was over, not by choice, but by the raw force of nature pressing him to retreat. Hours stretched as he limped through the woods, following faint trails back toward camp. Every sound made him flinch. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a crow. Each noise could have been the buck returning, driven by the same rage that had nearly ended him. His rifle, still jammed, gave no comfort, and he relied only on the slow steps that carried him away from the ridge. By dusk, he reached camp, exhausted and bloodied, where fellow hunters rushed to help. They cleaned his wounds, wrapped torn flesh, and listened as he recounted how a misplaced shot had changed the course of the day. The story spread quickly, a warning carved into words as clear as the scars on his skin. In the Ozark woods, no man could ever underestimate the strength of a wounded animal in rut. The aftermath left more than cuts and bruises. Caleb carried with him a deeper lesson, that in wild places, precision meant survival, and even a single mistake could unleash chaos no rifle could fully control. Late September 2024 in Pennsylvania's Allegheny Mountains brought silence to a remote cabin as hunters Owen Callister and Reese Donnelly settled in after a long day on the ridges. Their rifles rested near the entry, the air filled with the scent of venison stew simmering over the stove. Outside, the forest pressed close, the wind shifting through the dark trees, carrying smells far beyond what men could sense. By midnight, that same smell reached the wrong set of lungs. The stillness was shattered when the door split inward with a thunderous crack. A massive black bear, weighing more than 400 pounds, forced its way inside, its bulk scattering wood and splinters into the room. The animal lunged with shocking speed, driven by hunger and rage. Owen reached for his rifle, the weapon bucking in his hands as he fired point blank. The shot struck the head but slid across thick bone, failing to slow the rush. In an instant, claws tore through cloth and flesh, the beast slamming him hard into the log wall. Furniture splintered as the struggle raged. Chairs overturned, the table broke in half, and stew spilled across the floor in steaming pools. Owen's body bore the brunt of the first attack, claws ripping across his chest and throat with crushing weight. His rifle clattered uselessly to the floorboards, wood stained beneath him. Reese tried to raise his own weapon, fumbling as the bolt caught in its chamber. Panic surged while the predator pressed deeper into the cabin. The beast turned, eyes burning in the glow of the firelight, and roared. Reese pulled hard at the jammed rifle, but it refused to fire. He backed toward the far wall, grabbing at anything that might serve as a shield. The bear swiped at the air, its paw smashing through a chair, fragments spraying into the shadows. Owen lay still now, his body broken in the corner, while the predator stomped across the small room, tearing at whatever remained upright. The log walls groaned under its weight as the bear moved, crashing against shelves, sending pans clattering across the floor. The cabin that had once been a refuge became a trap, every corner filled with noise and wreckage. Only after minutes of chaos did the predator pause, ears twitching at distant sounds outside. The dog from a nearby homestead barked faintly in the distance, the echo carrying through the valley. With a final growl, the black shadow pulled back, retreating through the splintered doorway and vanishing into the dark forest. The silence that followed was heavier than the crash that had begun it. Reese stood shaking, his weapon useless in his hands, the cabin reduced to ruin. Smoke from the overturned stove drifted in slow curls, mixing with the iron scent of blood. Inside that wreckage, survival had become a hollow word. One man stood trembling, the other lay still, and the cabin that promised safety had shown just how easily the wild could tear it apart. The silence in the ruined cabin stretched into something heavier than sound. Reese stood frozen near the shattered wall, chest heaving, hands trembling, as he clutched a weapon that had failed him. The bear had gone, but its trail of destruction lingered in every corner. Smoke curled lazily from the stove where the pot of stew had spilled, mixing with the smell of blood and damp wood. Shards of furniture covered the floor, jagged and splintered, each one marked by claws. His ears still rang from the crash, his body numb with the realization that safety had never truly existed inside these walls. The weight of what remained pressed hardest when his eyes fell on Owen. His friend lay in the corner, chest torn open, clothes soaked dark, face stilled by the force of the strike. The cabin that had been filled with voices and firelight hours earlier was now silent except for the faint creak of timbers. Kneeling beside him, Reese felt the helpless truth settle like stone. No shot, no bolt, no shelter had saved him. Survival was his alone, and that truth cut deeper than any wound. Minutes dragged into an hour as Reese searched through the wreckage. He gathered whatever gear had not been destroyed, his hands fumbling as he tried to light a lantern, the flame flickering weakly against the gloom. Outside, the forest shifted with night sounds, every snap of a branch sending his heart pounding, every gust of wind pressing the doorframe inward as if the beast might return. He barred the doorway with what wood he could find, though the barrier felt meaningless after watching a predator break it down once before. As dawn crept over the ridges, light revealed the scale of ruin. The cabin floor was a map of claw marks, food scattered in piles, and overturned shelves spilling contents across the ground. Owen's rifle lay twisted against the hearth, its barrel bent by the crash, while Reese's jam weapon rested useless in his lap. Outside, prints in the mud showed the bear's retreat, massive depressions leading back into the thick trees. Yet the presence of the beast still hung in the air, as though the woods themselves carried its breath. When Reese finally staggered down the mountain path hours later, exhaustion and grief weighed heavier than the pack on his shoulders. His clothes bore bloodstains not his own, and his eyes carried the hollow look of a man who had faced something beyond comprehension. Villagers who heard his account spoke in hushed tones, their disbelief tempered by the sight of his trembling hands and the torn gear he carried. Officials soon inspected the cabin, their faces grim as they noted how easily the door had given way and how even close-range fire had failed. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the Allegheny ridges. Hunters spoke of it in warning, families whispered of it by firelight, and the wilderness itself seemed to grow darker in memory. The cabin, once a retreat, stood scarred and empty, its doors splintered and its walls marked by claws. Reese carried on, but with the knowledge that walls and weapons could not erase the truth. In the mountains, nature would always hold the final word, and men were only visitors, fragile and brief. Late September 2023 in Romania's Carpathian Mountains, mist wrapped tightly around the steep ridges, turning every step into a test of balance and focus. Alin Popescu moved quietly along the slope, his .3006 Winchester steady in his hands, the 4 to 12 times scope scanning the forest for signs of a red deer he had been tracking since dawn. The earth was slick with fallen leaves, the trail broken by jagged roots and patches of moss that clung to every stone. The hunt demanded patience, yet the silence of the valley carried something unusual that caught his attention. A faint groaning carried upward through the fog. He paused, rifle angled low, eyes scanning the clearing below. There, sprawled on the damp ground, lay another hunter. His clothes were torn from the fall, his face pale from strain, and one leg bent sharply at a wrong angle. The pain was visible in the way his body twisted, his rifle lying useless beside him. Aline descended carefully, each step cautious against the loose soil that could send him tumbling too. Reaching the injured man, he quickly recognized the situation. The leg was broken, and movement without care could make the damage far worse. Setting his rifle aside, Aline knelt and gave him water, steadying his shaking hand. The man introduced himself as Victor Ionescu, his words thin from the pain of the accident. His pack was scattered across the moss, and some of its contents spilled down the slope. Checking through the gear, Aline found no proper tools for treatment. With no choice, he gathered thick branches, trimming them smooth with his knife, and formed an improvised splint. Strips of cloth torn from spare fabric bound it tight against the fractured limb. Each pull drew a muffled cry from Victor, but without support, the journey ahead would be impossible. The path back was brutal. Supporting Victor's weight on his shoulder, Aline guided him step by step along the ridge. Slippery roots threatened to drag them down, rocks slid underfoot, and the mist deepened until the world shrank to only a few yards ahead. Sweat mixed with cold air stung his eyes, but he pressed forward. The forest pressed silent except for the sound of their uneven strides, one steady and one dragging. Hours passed in a rhythm of pain and determination, both men straining against the mountain's obstacles. At last, the ridge broke into a narrow forest road. Through the fog, shadows moved, figures waiting with anxious eyes. Victor's companions rushed forward, their disbelief written plain across their faces as they took in his injuries and the man who had brought him back alive. Grateful voices filled the still air, but Aline only stepped aside, his body heavy with exhaustion. The rifles they carried could bring down game, yet it was not steel or power that had carried them through. It was presence, instinct, and the will to act. On that cold September day, amid the rugged Carpathians, the truth stood clear. In the wilderness, hunting skill meant little compared to the strength of human care. One misplaced step could end a life, yet one decision to help could save it. The forest road where Victor was carried from the ridge did not end the trial. Though his companions were relieved, the journey forward demanded its own endurance. They lowered him gently onto a stretcher, the improvised splint still firm around his leg. Aline stepped back, his body aching from hours of supporting another man's weight, but his focus stayed sharp as he scanned the surrounding slopes. The Carpathians did not forgive distraction, and the same ridges that had injured Victor could just as easily claim more lives if they lingered too long. The small group moved steadily down the trail, their boots crunching damp soil. Every dip and root became an obstacle, the stretcher bearers pausing often to regain balance. Alan walked beside them, eyes fixed ahead, guiding where the path narrowed or tilted dangerously toward drop-offs. The mist thickened as evening fell, wrapping the world in gray, until even the outlines of trees blurred into shadows. Still, they pressed forward, knowing that darkness in these mountains carried its own risks. By the time they reached the lower valley, lanterns flickered from a rustic lodge built for hunters and travelers. Relief swept across the group as they carried Victor inside, the warmth of firelight replacing the biting air of the ridges. His leg was inspected by more practiced hands who confirmed the bone was fractured badly, but held in place by Aline's splint. Though crude, it had prevented worse damage. Blankets were layered over Victor, hot broth placed beside him, and for the first time since his fall, his face relaxed from its mask of pain. Aline settled near the hearth, exhaustion weighing down his body. His hands bore cuts from the rough branches he had shaped, his clothes torn from brushing against rocks and roots. Yet the silence in the room gave him space to reflect. Hunting had brought him into the wilderness for sport, But the day had given him something far more profound. Rifles, scopes, and ammunition had no use when the need was to keep a man alive through patience and effort. News of the rescue spread quickly among those staying at the lodge. Other hunters and guides spoke of the ordeal in hushed tones, remarking on the fragility of men who tested the mountain's edges. Some noted how easily one slip could end in death. Others how rare it was to see such determination in helping a stranger. Victor's companions expressed gratitude again and again, but Alan only nodded, knowing that no thanks could erase the weight of what might have been. As dawn lit the peaks the next morning, the land looked calm, its ridges glowing with golden mist. Yet, for Alan, the slopes carried scars unseen by others. Each root and ledge reminded him of the moment when survival balanced on the presence of mind. The Carpathians were more than a place for hunts. They were a place where human care could mean life or death. Late September 2025 in Montana's Bitterroot Range opened in pale light, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. Daniel Mercer moved carefully along a ridgeline, his .300 Weatherby Magnum cradled against his shoulder, the Night Force scope glinting faintly in the dawn haze. He had spent days tracing signs of a massive bull elk, following rubs on saplings, and the raw echoes of bugles drifting up from the valleys. That morning, with the wind in his favor and the forest hushed, he felt closer than ever. Each step pressed into damp needles, the earth firm beneath his boots, the stillness broken only by the faint rustle of squirrels and the distant caw of a raven. Yet even in the calm, a charge of energy lingered in the air, as if the mountains themselves waited to unveil something hidden. The first warning came not from sight, but from sound. A crashing roar surged from the valley below, the kind of deep, guttural thunder that spoke of raw force tearing through timber. Before Daniel could react, a bull elk burst from the shadows, muscles rippling under its hide, antlers raking branches into splinters as it barreled uphill. Its sides heaved, foam spraying from its muzzle, each stride powered by desperation rather than grace. Daniel dropped low, instinct forcing him behind the cover of a fallen log, heart hammering as hooves tore the earth apart just yards away. Then came the true terror. Out of the underbrush thundered a grizzly bear of colossal size, its bulk tearing saplings from the ground as if they were reeds. At over 1,000 pounds, it moved with speed that defied its mass, jaws open wide as it surged after the elk. The ridgeline shook beneath its weight, stones scattering, branches snapping, the forest alive with the chaos of predator and prey locked in a furious chase. The bull thundered past within 10 yards of Daniel's cover, the sound deafening, the stench of sweat and musk thick in the air. He barely had time to lift his rifle, thumbs snapping the safety free before the grizzly skidded on loose granite, its momentum sending gravel spraying across the slope. For one breathless moment, its eyes locked with his, dark pools that radiated both hunger and fury. Daniel steadied the crosshairs on its chest, the rifle trembling under the pressure of decision, every nerve in his body ready to fire. Yet the bear did not charge him. With a low, guttural growl, it tore its gaze away and pivoted, muscles rippling as it resumed the pursuit of the elk. Within seconds, predator and prey vanished into the tree line, their roars and crashes fading until only silence remained. The forest seemed to exhale, as though the mountain itself had drawn back its fury. Daniel sat frozen, sweat cold against his skin, his rifle still raised though the danger had passed. The ridgeline lay scarred around him. Broken branches littered the ground, dust floated in beams of dawn light, and hoofprints and claw marks carved chaotic paths across the slope. His body shook as he lowered the rifle, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The realization struck hard. He had not been hunter or bystander, but instead had stood on the thin line where survival of predator and prey collided. One heartbeat slower, one misstep wrong, and he could have been crushed beneath hooves or torn apart by claws. The ridge returned to calm, but Daniel could not. He sat crouched behind the log, listening to his pulse echo louder than the silence, knowing the Bitterroot Range had revealed its raw truth. In those mountains, he was never the master, only another life balanced on chance. Late September 2025 in Montana's Bitterroot Range left Daniel Mercer crouched behind the fallen log long after the thunder of hooves and the growl of the grizzly had faded into the trees. His hands still shook as he lowered the rifle. The Night Force scope fogged from his breath, the weight of the .300 Weatherby heavy against his chest. Around him, the ridgeline bore the marks of the chaos. Claw gouges carved into the granite, splintered branches dangling like broken spears, and deep hoof prints stamped into the earth, each one pressed with the full force of panic. He realized the ridge had not simply hosted a chase, but had nearly swallowed him into it. Daniel remained frozen for several minutes, afraid to move, his senses sharp to every rustle in the underbrush. The silence after such violence felt unnatural, as though the mountains were waiting for another outburst. When he finally rose, his legs trembled under him, knees weak from adrenaline and fear. He forced himself to scan the timber, checking the slope below where the predator and elk had disappeared. The forest looked calm, but he knew better than to trust its stillness. Every shadow seemed heavy, every whisper of wind a warning. He began the slow walk down the ridge, careful not to snap twigs or step too loudly. His boots slipped against loose soil where the elk had churned the ground, and several times he nearly lost his balance. Each mark left by the bear reminded him how close he had come to being crushed or torn apart. He touched one claw gouge in the granite, its edges sharp as if carved by a blade, and the thought chilled him. His own body could have been split just as easily. Hours passed as he descended toward camp, every step haunted by the image of dark eyes locking with his through the rising dust. The sound of that guttural growl stayed in his ears, echoing louder than the crunch of his boots on fallen needles. The rifle felt heavier with each mile, its power diminished in his mind. He had carried it with the belief it would keep him safe, yet on that ridge, it had been little more than a fragile tool in the face of raw force and speed. By the time he reached camp, twilight had spread across the Bitterroots, shadows long and sharp across the valley. His tent stood untouched, but the area felt foreign, no longer a place of rest, but a reminder of vulnerability. He sank to the ground, his body aching, his chest tight, and allowed himself to breathe deeply for the first time since dawn. The elk was gone, the bear was gone, yet their presence filled the night air as if the mountains themselves carried their weight. News of his ordeal traveled quickly once he returned to town days later. Locals listened with wide eyes as he described the chase, the bull thundering within arm's reach, the grizzlies pause and stare. Hunters nodded in silence, each knowing that rifles and skill often mean little when the wild decides to test its power. Officials later marked the ridge as an area of caution, warning others that fall meant heightened risks as predators followed prey into narrow passes. For Daniel, the experience carved deeper than warnings or scars. The mountains he once walked with confidence now stood as a reminder of balance, where man was never more than a visitor. His nights were filled with flashes of antlers and the echo of claws scraping stone, dreams that replayed the moment where his life had balanced on a breath. He understood at last that in the Bitterroot, survival belonged not to the strongest rifle or the keenest eye, but to chance and to the mountain itself.